I'm sort of at a disadvantage here. I haven't seen what you guys have done so far. So I just decided to talk about things I thought were a big deal, particularly with respect to finance or at least economics. But before I do that, I will say, since this is the first talk, a little bit about where I'm coming from when I'm trying to talk about intelligence and the thing that we're trying to regulate here. So it's a very simple definition, actually dating back to the 19th century, when people were trying to compare animals to each other. So intelligence is just doing the right thing at the right time, or more specifically, being able to take advantage of opportunities or deal with issues. Or another way to say that is actually that it's a form of computation. So it's a physical process of taking information about the current context and transforming that into action. And that requires time, space, and energy. So it's not a magic process that happens instantaneously. And no matter how many algorithms you have or how big of computers you have, you will never know everything. You'll never perfectly predict the future for the whole world or something. So moving along, straight along. There we go. Yeah, so some people, when they talk about that, they say, oh, that's not what I meant by intelligent. I'm concerned about, big moral considerations. And so they think, well, maybe it's about agency. And well, agents are any vector for change. Again, you can have, chemical agents. Those are the things that actually react in a chemical reaction. Again, not what you really mean. Okay, to make a long story shorter, what you do care about is moral agency, almost definitionally, especially in the law. You want to know who's responsible for what. And so moral agents are those a society considers to be responsible. And moral patients are those that a society considers that you have responsibility towards. Okay, so for example, the environment is something that is not a moral agent. We can't hold it responsible for things, but many people think the environment is now a moral patient, that we need to take care of it. It's a moral obligation to take care of it. But on the other hand, with moral agents, as I just mentioned, there's changes in time about who is a moral agent. So at what point are you old enough to decide for yourself who you can have sex with, or to get married, or to fight in a war? And societies don't agree on these things. So I would argue, and none of the rest of this is definitions you could look up in a dictionary, but I would argue that ethics is actually determined by and determines a society, right? Society has slightly different ethical systems that consist of those things, like agreeing who are the moral agents, who has rights, who has obligations. And I would also say a lot of people are trying to have this perfectly fair, unbiased world. I have some friends where one of their children has multiple sclerosis. Every day he wakes up less able to do things, and every day his sister wakes up more able to do things. There's no fairness there. Right? So what we try to do with the law is improve on that. We're constantly trying to that word. It's a property that moral agents of a society assign to each other. It almost defines the fact that you're a moral agent is that you are responsible. Okay, and I would argue, and this is going to be the main thrust of my talk here, that requires more or less pure capacities. All right, so you don't, if you're something that was designed, you're not going to have the same situation. Whereas all adult humans more or less have the same length of life. And well, I just said that it's not always fair, but more or less we have the same sort of general capacities. So accountability is our capacity to trace who has responsibility. And when you use artificial intelligence, you could, because it's digital, keep track of everything that happened and have a perfect record of who did what to whom. Or you could delete those records because it's digital. It's really easy to delete the records. I still strongly recommend keeping physical records of things because you don't know who's going to come into your computers, right? So accountability is the way that we trace responsibility, and transparency is the means by which accountability is implemented, okay? Transparency is not something you're trying to do. It's not itself an aim. You could get, in fact, you see people disinforming by giving too much information, flooding millions of lines of code or too many statements. True transparency is something that can be embraced by a brain, right? And that's the kind of thing that the EU is now requiring that corporations provide to us with the Digital Services Act. We want something we can understand and that we can check that they've done the right kind of work. Okay. So trust, I'm actually not talking that much about trust today. I'm sorry, I should have left this bullet out. But again, it's also about peer relationships. Okay. And then, so it's not that we want to trust powerful agencies. Rather, we need to find ways to coordinate so that we can be peers with them, right? And that's what we use government for. Okay, so government is whatever does enforcement in a geographic area. Unfortunately, I just put this bullet in for you guys. This is a new one you won't have seen, even if you've seen my previous talks, because I'm kind of really tired of talking to people from the US West Coast who say, oh, the government doesn't work. We have to figure out a new way to do enforcement. First of all, you're sitting in an incredibly safe place. I mean, I know it's not perfectly safe, but if you're looking at Hobbes, he's like, oh, you wouldn't dream of going outside of your house without your sword on, would you? It's like, what? Okay, I'm in Europe, but I've never armed myself in my life, and I've lived a lot of my life in the United States, right? So you have all kinds of security being generated by your government. But anyway, the point is, if you did find another way to do enforcement, that would be your new government, and you'd have all the same problems, right? Or maybe worse ones if you go to something more like anarchy. All right, regulation then is just a process of perpetuation. Right? A lot of people think regulation is necessarily constraint, but a lot of regulation is upregulation, as we say in biology, right? So a lot of governments are working really hard to make sure they have strong digital sectors, but there are parts of
excuse me, ma'am.
Joanna?
Okay.
Oh, good, Glory. I think we're saying the same thing.
Okay, yes.
We're not seeing your slideshow.
Oh, geez, why did you not tell me before? Okay. All right, let me stop the share. Sorry about that, and I will try again. Okay, let me try. Great. So were you seeing it at all at any point?
We see you're sharing screen, but we are not seeing the different slides. It's not in a show. Now it is perfect.
Yeah, no, but I'm not sure. What happens if I do this? Did you see a build?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
You saw the gold bar come around?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay, all right. I'll send you the slide. Just as to remind me.
Yeah, sorry for not letting you know. Thanks.
But so far, I've just been reading them. It's not a big deal. Although there were some cool builds. Look, isn't that cool? All right.
Yes.
Okay, so there we are. Okay, and sorry, I was ignoring the chats, hoping that someone would tell me if anything was happening. All right. So, because I can't see it, it's all just one laptop. Sorry about that. All right, so regulation. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this peer relationship stuff. So this has been the main area I've been doing scientific research in for the last couple of years, which is trying to understand why it is that inequality, economic inequality, is highly correlated with political polarization, unlike social media use, which is what everybody's blaming. So it's been known for decades that there's this regularity. This is US data, actually, but you can find it in a lot of countries, although not all, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But anyway, it's not that any inequality is a bad thing. So inequality is typically measured on a scale of 0, where everybody has the same amount of money, to 1, where one person has all the money. And on that scale, empirically, there's no theory behind this. 0.27 seems to be the best, the best amount. So it seems like we do need a little bit of inequality to motivate ourselves or to get money to the most capable people or whatever. But if it gets over about 0.3, we start seeing things fall off, like a reduction in social mobility. The economy actually starts going down after 0.4, reduction of innovation, and general insecurity, general entropy. And that's unfortunately what we had right before World War I and what we're facing right now. The interesting thing here is, to me, people sometimes talk about the great decoupling that happened in 1978 when wages stopped following productivity. But what I'm interested in is the great coupling that happened from 1933 until 1978 in the United States. And it happened a bit later in the rest of the world. There was an agreement called Bretton Woods in 1948 or something, where we did an awful lot of work to make sure that there was adequate redistribution and that nations didn't extract wealth from each other. And it's often the autocrats that do that. They take the wealth of their own country so that other people can't compete with them for power. So anyway, that was illegal for a few decades, and it sort of got re-innovated in the 70s, and a lot of things have happened. So I mentioned this already. So inequality cycles the fact that there's a feedback does seem to be some kind of regulatory capture, but what triggers them in the first place? We don't know for sure, but I suspect that part of what's going on here is distance reducing technologies. So whenever you introduce a new way to sell, to do business at a great distance, then there's going to be fewer winners, right? If we were all going to go out to a pub afterwards, even if we were in San Francisco, we wouldn't go to the best pub in Palo Alto or San Francisco or whatever, because we would go to one that was reasonably close by that could fit all of us into it, right? Some things are localized like that. But there's nothing that says we need more than one GPS system, except for we realize that's not good for security. So I believe right now there's 4 GPS systems globally. And there's at least 2 airplane companies, right? Only because the EU put a lot of money into making Airbus, right? And so similarly, there's only one search engine that anyone uses, well, that 80% of people use, right? Those are the kinds of things that can cause problems. I'm going to skip this because I think we're going a little bit slow. It's just a little discussion of natural monopoly, but this is not an economics talk. Let me get back to my paper that I'm very excited about. So this came out in actually December 2020. And it was, so we're trying to understand why it is that inequality might be causing polarization. Is there something about that? And so we came up with a theory. One thing that a lot of people believe, and there's a little bit of evidence for this, not as much, I'd like to see more science on this, is that when you work with a diverse outgroup, you have a higher expected outcome. You're going to be able to solve more kinds of problems. And there's indications that boards that are more diverse have better payoffs from the companies, things like that. So then why doesn't everybody work with the outgroup all the time? There must be some trade-off. And so we guessed, there's no data on this, that maybe it's that when you work with the in-group, you can better predict what's going to happen. Okay, so why would you rather have a lower risk than have a higher return, a higher expected outcome? Well, it turns out that, first of all, our model shows that those hypotheses would create the dynamics we anticipated. So what this figure shows is that on the far right there, you're seeing how we set up the model. So basically the y-axis is what is the probability that if you work with the outgroup, it's going to collapse, it's not going to work. And so we chose to make the model so that even if it's failing half the time, it's still better to work with the diverse outgroup. Okay, so that's what's going on the y-axis. The x-axis is how good is your economy. So what I just said applies to the far right for the best possible economy. And then what you're seeing is that as the economy gets worse, it becomes a good idea to cooperate with people more like yourselves. Why? Well, that's only true if there's a big cliff. Like if you lose, you aren't going to be able to make it unless you get that next payment, right? So you're worried about something like a bankruptcy, foreclosure, losing custody of your children, dying, starving. Those kinds of things motivate reducing the risk rather than getting the best possible payoff. Okay, so that's what's going on there. You might notice, of course, that if things get way worse, it gets to be a good idea to work with the outgroup again. Why? That's because you know that you're not going to make it with only the amount that you're definitely getting from your in-group. And so then it's called gambling for redemption. You know that you might fail, but it's your only chance is to work with the outgroup again. Okay, so as I mentioned, this is caused by these large discontinuities. And then this last point is that none of this explained inequality. Why would what's inequality got to do with this? It's only if a government or there is insufficient regulation such that as inequality increases, it's allowed to create false scarcities. So all the money goes to the top and the rest of the economy, even if the economy is doing well, most people are getting less and less. Okay, that's when it would be correlated to a poor economy, and this model would make sense. So that was what we, that was a modeling paper but it explained data that people had known for 40 years and nobody knew what was going on. This is new results that we have that are not yet published, but just so you can see it, we validated the model looking at mostly European countries just because we had the most data on them. We were trying to look over the world. But what you see is that indeed, when inequality goes up, polarization goes up. But what really goes down is trust. So in a way, you can think of polarization and trust, I think that's a build here, as the flip sides of each other. Polarization is when you stop trusting people you don't know or who aren't like you. You probably even stop trusting yourself, but you just have a pretty good idea that a bunch of you are constrained to do the same thing. All right. So I want to talk about one more thing if I have time. How much time do I have left? Glory?
8 minutes.
10 minutes.
8 minutes. Oh, okay, great. Fantastic. Okay, then I can show you two things. Cool. So a lot of people were showing slides like this around Europe for about 5 years. It was driving me nuts. Another thing that was happening in 2020 when I was working on this. Papers always come out after you do the work, right? So the data I'm going to show you is from 2020, but this is a meme slide. This is one that is false. Notice that it's conflating Asia and China. So there's like a graph, somebody's sciencey kind of graph in the middle that's got Samsung, which is a Korean company in it, and then somebody's put China outside of that. And what people were using this graph to show us was that the EU should stay out of the way of America, or else China was going to eat us all. Now, the thing here, there's so many problems with this, but one of the problems is, well, what are we seeing? Oh, it's the top 20 platforms. Well, what even is a platform? Who knows? But also, why show us the top 20? There's this thing called antitrust. And so it may be that if you're only looking at the largest companies, that you're seeing badly regulated areas. So what information are you really getting? So we decided to do, and we here is a colleague, Helena Malikova, who works with the European Commission in the Directorate General of Competition. To be honest, she did most of the data work here, and I just did most of the words work. But we decided to look at two things, which was, first of all, what you just saw there, which was market capitalization. And then secondly, also the IP that was being recorded as patents. Now, again, if you look at this graph here, it's not that Facebook and Apple are not creative. They're super creative. They're generating all kinds of innovation, but they're not patenting it. That's not how they choose to defend themselves. So patenting is a choice. And what she still has trouble believing, but I feel very strongly about, market capitalization, it's not that like anyone could just get a patent. It's also not like any company could just suddenly be as big as Google. But the amount that you invest in trying to increase your market capitalization, your shareholder prices, whatever, that is a decision that boards sit together and make. Sometimes you don't even go private. You don't even go public, right? Sometimes you stay private. Two companies here that are basically both too entangled with their governments to go public, Huawei and Robert Bosch, are not public, but we didn't include non-public companies here. But you can see like IBM has been doing patents forever, and they're not that large, but they're competitive with Microsoft and Google, who really do compete for engineers based on how much they can get them patent revenues. All right, so in case your eyeballs aren't good at straightening this all out and figuring out what's really happening, here's the bar charts. And so what we showed was that it's indeed not binary. The US, at this particular year, which is roughly 2019, the US was dominating both of these metrics more than the rest of the world combined, all right? But the EEA, which is the area that was being hampered by GDPR, and China were actually somewhat comparable. China does have some more market capitalization in this figure. But the rest of the world is actually much larger than EEA and China. Okay, I don't have a graph for this, so I'm just going to tell you about this. We've now looked at more years, and actually, also, I didn't tell you this. Helena, because her time was limited, she was doing this nights and weekends, only looked at companies with at least 2 patents. So if you look at every company that had at least 1 patent in AI, then it's much more equal even than this. Between the US and China, between the EEA and China. And if you look at the most recent years, the rest of the world and China both have now gotten to very similar numbers to the US. The EEA, while much bigger numbers than these, are not accelerating at the same level. And most of the acceleration is actually in patents, but there's been some acceleration in market capitalization in other regions. Okay, so I do think that the EU rocks. That's one of the three economies, although the three biggest economies, and arguably it was the biggest one in 2007 and maybe for a few years after that. But it's comparable to China and the US, and it doesn't get mentioned very often. And it's leading in some really important domains. I mean, most of the world in 2021 was either exporting all their vaccinations, like China and India, or keeping all their vaccinations, like the US and the UK. The EU is the only one that was half exporting and half importing, is keeping, so they're both vaccinating their own people and vaccinating others, including charitable, not as much as we should have done, but better than other people were doing in terms of charitable, but also more generally on climate crisis, sustainability, things like that. So it's an important area that does have innovation and economic strength. And so I hate it when people say there's no value to what it's doing. The last thing I'm going to show you now is, again, something that's in preparation that we haven't released, but there's a bunch of telcos, telephone companies, basically comms companies in the EU saying that they ought to be allowed to consolidate the way the American ones have. And so they say we can't invest in infrastructure because we're not as big as the US ones. Now, what this graphs show you is basically that the EU ones invest a higher proportion of their money into the infrastructure than the US ones do. But is that good? Maybe they don't have as much money, right? So that's not enough. Okay, for the next graphs, we need this little key. I'm going to show you a key. So when you're trying to understand what's going on with quite a lot of money these days, there's content providers. They're going to be like these blue and these gray things. So like, the New York Times or YouTube are going to be, there's things that people want to watch. And then there's a couple of agencies, maybe three, that are selling access to those things. Okay, these digital ad exchanges. And then there's some other things that are aggregators. So in theory, companies can sell directly. Like if you're trying to sell a car, you might go directly to the digital ad exchange, and because car companies spend a lot on advertising. But quite often there's these other things called ad exchanges, which the ad agencies, which are consolidating. Okay, so just try to remember those colors there, because now I'm going to show you the data. So what you see here is the Facebook and the Google and Yandex, which is Russian, are ad exchanges. Okay, so these are the companies, and this is how much money they're making. Okay, so the x-axis here is how profitable they are, and the y-axis is how much they're growing. So Google's been big forever. Facebook is still growing, so that's why it's up in the corner there. But look at the telcos. The telcos are comparable size to Google ad revenue, right? Now the red ones are the American ones, and the blue ones are the European ones. And they're just about as profitable as each other, right? They're right on top of each other. And then over on the left there, you see both the guys making the money, which are some money at times, at least News Corp is, Springer is, and also those other kinds of agencies that were doing the aggregation. So that's just for comparison, and Netflix, of course. See, those are for comparison. All right. Now this is before you've spent the money on investing in infrastructure. Now let's take a look at it after they've had to invest in infrastructure. Okay, now you see that the European guys, it's all shifted a little to the left. They're all a little less profitable because they've had to invest in their own infrastructure, but the Europeans have had to go further left. But they're still profitable. Normally when people ask to be allowed to consolidate or something,
We lost your sound, Joanna, and 30 seconds. That some of the arguments being made to competition people are false.
So that's just words saying what I said because it took me a while to learn this stuff. I didn't used to do competition. All right, so in summary, governance is actually a terrific way to make the world fairer. The world didn't start fair, we have to do work. And it's also one of the ways by which we coordinate our security. Again, it's almost the definition of ethics, holding society together. The problems we're facing now are not all new to the digital age. We had inequality before, we had misinformation before, we had war before. These are things we know about, but it is probably true that when you innovate technologically, you need to also figure out ways to innovate in terms of governance to handle those, the new, for example, how much easier it is to influence people in other countries right now. Probably takes some innovation. So it may be that our current turn yours on.
I know.
It may be that some of the IR issues we're having now are because we didn't do well enough on this earlier, and then we go. The excesses of individuals can only be modulated by their need for cooperation with peers. And so that's why I think these are the biggest issues we need to be thinking about right now.
Uh-oh.
Yes, we will.
Thank you very much, Joanna. And I just wanted to mention that we'll be doing Q&A after our next speaker for both of our first two speakers. So if you have questions for Joanna, please either drop them in the chat or just hold them for a few more minutes and we'll do a Q&A session very soon. I am very pleased to introduce our second speaker, Anzetse. Anzetse is a senior development economist in Kenya with years of experience in research and strategy development in Africa. Today, Anzetse will lead our discussion on technology and the future of the financial sector in Africa, including the role of technology in financial inclusion and the fostering of an ethical and dynamic innovation system. Thank you for joining us today, Anzetse, and I will turn it over to you. Are you able to share your slides now?
I think so. Can you hear me and can you see my slides?
Yes.
Sometimes the mode I get a bit. Is it in the right mode? Or are you seeing it in my mode? Anyways, first of all, thank you very much, Joanna. I think I really want to unpack a lot of what you just walked us through, because particularly for the levels of income inequality and economic inequality that we're grappling with on the continent, I think what you're saying is very pertinent and perhaps provides an intellectual approach that's not considered. So thank you very much. And I would like to thank Soren and Elise and everybody for inviting me. So I'm just going to give you a sense of the approach that I'm going to take to my presentation. So I'm really looking at technology and the future of the financial sector in Africa, and we're going to look at the role of ethical innovation, and just to give you that as the framing. Okay, so first of all, why is technology important? Why has it been such an important story for inclusion and equality, financial equality in Africa? I mean, I'll just take the case of Kenya. I will preface this by saying Kenya is by far the frontier country when it comes to fostering financial inclusion across the population. And technology, particularly mobile money, has been instrumental in that. So as Andrew mentioned, I come from a company called FSD Kenya, and one of the things we do with the Central Bank of Kenya, which is the regulator for the banking sector, and the National Bureau of Statistics, is we track financial inclusion every 2 years, and it's a nationwide exercise. So you can see on the left there that financial inclusion, when we started this work in 2006, financial inclusion was at about 26%, which means about 26% of adults had access to financial services. We are now at 83%. Yeah. And so often when people talk about Kenyan financial inclusion, there's almost a sense that you guys have finished. You guys are done with the financial inclusion. Everybody can access financial services, and financial services are very important, a conduit or a lever for economic opportunity and leveraging that. On the right, you can see where that has been driven.
We have the same issue. Your slides are not moving. They are not in presentation mode.
Let me.
What happened with me was I just came out and went back in. I did exactly the same thing, and then it worked. I have no idea. I think it's a Zoom thing. Just try again.
Okay, let me try.
Just doing a
Sometimes it doesn't-
slideshow, man.
I know I am in one of those weird modes and I never know how to.
Perfect.
That's good.
We see them. Great.
Oh, is it right? Is it
Yeah.
right now?
Yeah, it's
I
perfect.
don't think I did anything.
It's
Okay,
perfect.
so can you see the slide now?
Yeah.
No?
Yep.
Okay, okay.
See the preview mode, though, that's fine. We can read them. And it was just like mine. I had the same thing that you went in and come out in just a
Okay.
second. Who knows?
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you for telling me. So this left bit, as I said, went from 26% to 83%, almost 84%. This is despite COVID. So despite the economic shock that was COVID, we still registered a slight uptick in financial inclusion. And here, I'll share these slides. You can see that the main drivers for that have been mobile money, which is frankly a market dominant player there. So that just gives you the background of the role technology has had in giving particularly Kenyans access to financial services. I just want to say that, while people congratulate Kenya on financial inclusion and how important that's been in allowing people to live improved lives, the reality is that we have real problems with the quality of financial inclusion. And the reason I say this is because there's a deep need for a continued level of innovation in our economies to not only solve our financial inclusion problems, but our other economic issues. So these are some of the big ones, the financial literacy challenges that we still have. Another one is unexpected charges and transparencies. And you'll be surprised that this still happens even with digital options. There's still a lack of transparency in terms of customers understanding what they're being charged and why. The other big thing we have is money loss and incidences of fraud. So as you pivot people onto platforms and to leverage technology, we're being run into this. And then the other big one is poor services and system downtime. So if you look at something like the mobile money platform, where on average, about half of our GDP on average goes through this mobile money platform. It's not a small platform. And so when you're looking at that level of use, system downtime is a real concern. And this is something that does not only hit the mobile money side, but also other aspects of digitized financial services like ATMs and POS machines, etc. The other big thing we've been seeing is mobile gambling. Mobile gambling has really picked up in Kenya. And for 18 to 25 years olds, which is where we start counting at 18, but we do know that a lot of children under the age of 18 who do have phones are engaging in mobile gambling. What's worrying us is that 15% of these young people actually think betting is a source of income. So they don't see it as an entertainment activity. They're beginning to see it as a source of income, which is, that's that. So one of the things we started looking at was, okay, fine, financial inclusion is great, but why are we still struggling with quality of life issues? Why aren't we seeing this show up in the lived lives and improved lives of Kenyans, of Africans generally? Just to say that I am centering Kenya for two reasons. One, that's where we have the most data in terms of where we're set, but also because we are at the leading frontier. So if we're grappling with these issues, it can sort of signal maybe some of the things that particularly the students in this conversation can begin to look at as well. So we've been distinguishing between financial health and financial inclusion. So financial health, in our view, provides information on the outcome of financial inclusion. So why do you want people to be financially included anyway? It's because you want to improve their financial health. Now, the financial health, we also know, is reliant on dynamics beyond the financial sector. The economic system that you're sitting in, global and local issues all affect it. So I'll just give you through how we measure financial health and some of the struggles that we're seeing there. So really measure financial health in three ways. One is the ability of people to manage day to day. The main one being food. Are you able to get food regularly? And so we ask them in this sort of survey that we do, did you ever go without food last year? That was the main one. The second big thing we look at is the ability to cope with risk. So if a shock happens, whatever that is, an education, a health shock, someone dies, or an income shock, let's say you lose a job, or some other sort of emergency, are you able to deal with that? So one of the ways we ask them to do that is, can you get a hold of the amount you need in 3 days? Because if you can't get a hold of the amount you need in 3 days, that begins to affect the quality of your life. And then the third thing we really look at is, are you able to invest in your future? And of course, for many Africans, and I think for many people in Africa and South America and Asia, it's education. One of the biggest goals a lot of people have is investing in education, either for themselves or for their children. and then also, retirement. So that's a third thing. Are you able to do that? And what we saw, we started really doing this metric only in 2016 because we were seeing that incongruence in the increase in financial inclusion, but a deterioration in how people were describing the state of their lives. And so you can see in each metric, it's basically been going down, but really at the end of the day, whereas in 2016, about 39.4% of Kenyans said they were financially healthy, that's down to 17%. So I say that because, this demonstrates that we really need to, the need for innovation in our economy is not going anywhere. So I want to go on the next slide, but it won't let me. Okay, so yeah, so now I'm going to talk about fintech specifically, and to sort of help understand the level of dynamism of fintech investment in Africa. So first of all, I should have said this before, I'm an economist. So I'm looking at this from an innovation systems point of view. I'm looking at this from a finance systems point of view. And then I'm looking at this from an economic systems point of view. So if you're looking at this from the finance systems, the entry of fintech or any sort of investment outside of extractives for Africa has been transformational. For the longest time, the main type of investment the continent was getting was metals, minerals, and fuels, almost exclusively. But really over the past, I'd say 10 to 12 years, we've seen a deeper focus on technology, manufacturing, and services, right? So in 2020, after the business services sector, telecoms and technology were actually the largest for anchoring in FDI projects. And if you look at last year, fintech is by far the most dynamic of the technology sector. So in 2020, 33% of total tech investment, startup investments in Africa went to fintech. And in 2021, as you're seeing the big spike there, 50% of all tech startup funding of 2 billion went to fintech. That is not evenly distributed. About 4 countries are capturing the lion's share of that. So that's Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, and Kenya getting about 81% of that. This is creating good things, but it's also beginning to create some problems. And just please note the jump between 2019 to 2021, right? So part of the pivot that COVID engendered, the pivot to digitization, I think has created an optimism. And it was one of, if you look at the sectoral resilience to COVID, there were certain sectors which were more resilient, obviously ICT and financial services being one of them. That's why you're seeing fintech, which combines financial services and ICT, getting so much money. So just to give you a background on, we've been working in innovating for the financial sector for about 5 years. We're closing down that program, sadly, but we did learn an immense amount. And just to give you an idea of the type of projects that we did work with, for those who are familiar with the Kenyan or the African ecosystem, we worked with Sun Culture, Apollo, Pula, Turaco, all the big innovators in fintech, Digifarm, we've worked with all of them. And we were specifically trying to look at how do we foster financial innovation for impact? So we're really looking at innovation for impact, because I think you can innovate for scale and for money, which is fine. But we're really trying to look at how do we innovate for impact to deal with the inequality issue. So this is how we define this. It's you innovate focused on low-income households and micro and small medium enterprises, often whom are neglected if you're leaving it to a purely market-driven approach, because they're just very difficult to either aggregate or reach, or frankly, having the money. The second thing is the innovations that we were looking at was we really wanted to strengthen the ability of low-income households and micro, small, and medium enterprises to participate effectively in the economy, either as consumers or as producers. And finally, we really wanted the innovation to add value to them. So we defined value as an innovation that's useful, that's trustworthy, and that's affordable. Ideally, the innovation should do all 3, but we find that you don't need to do all 3 to get market traction and for you to scale. So the way, as we were working in the innovation system, we saw, well, if you're really trying to engender an innovation culture that's solving real problems, there's sort of certain tools that you need to think through. The biggest one was relevant expertise, and we spent an enormous amount of money and time finding relevant expertise to innovators. And this is important because the types of problems that a lot of innovators of the continent are facing, first of the problems are they're trying to create such unconventional ways to solve it. that you often need a patchwork of different types of knowledge skills to actually get them together, to give them the right support to really to get their hands around the problem and to support this vision that they have. The other big thing was the mental and business models. That's been something you just sort of have to iterate over time. So what mental approaches are you using to make sure your innovation is solving for the problem that you're looking at? But also, how are you going to deal with your own business models? What do you need to do in the way you're structuring your business to make sure that your business can support your innovation sustainably, right? So those are some of the things we were looking at. Availability of appropriate capital. I'm going to get into this later. It's not just the availability of appropriate capital, it's the financial instruments and frankly, the lack of diversity. Because of the way innovation evolves over time, there's just really not enough, not only volume, but type. Then the other thing was research and evidence. One of the biggest challenges you're seeing is innovators thinking something makes sense and then not having the research and evidence to actually show that that's actually the problem too, and that the way they think the market will respond to their innovation is actually how the market will respond to their innovation. So we actually spent a lot of time in some specific sectors on research and evidence. And in some cases, after we did that, we're like, maybe don't solve for that because this informal way of solving for this, we don't see people pivoting out of that. So trying to spend a whole bunch of money, on some fintech solution, you may run into a lack of adoption because there's already a very well-trusted way that people are solving that may not be formal. So research and evidence is very important. Then the final piece is this technology. There's this default assumption technology always helps. We find that not always. Sometimes it helps, sometimes no. And so some of the way we deployed particularly appropriate capital, sometimes we did it leveraging technology, sometimes it wasn't. It just had traditional things like guaranteed funds. Some of the old school stuff sometimes still works. So I'm just gonna try and whiz through this, and please tell me how much time I have left so that I don't go over. When you're looking at ethical risks, so I'm doing this from a risk perspective, but this is also, you can do this from an impact perspective. The main issue that I've seen in the risk conversation is that how are the risks being defined, who is defining them? Because depending on where you're sitting in this ecosystem, you will have a different opinion on what risk is the big risk to be managed. So I'll take an example, and I actually read the case study, I believe in Kenya, which was a great one, on the issues that digital lenders have been facing around the pricing of their credit lines. And frankly, people saying it's extortive, it's Shylocky, it's far too expensive. But what we found is that for a lot of the consumers, the bigger risk was not having access to digital credit lines at all. So they were like, you guys want to bang on about, oh, credit lines are expensive, but please don't do that to the point that we don't even get access to those credit lines to begin with. So the risk that the firm is facing are very different to the risk that the consumers are facing, are very different at the value chain level. So, or subsector. So if you're looking at the risks that an insurance product or insurance regulator is dealing with, that's a bit distinct to someone who's maybe in the capital markets, right? Still the financial sector. Then there's a sector risk. So that's where the regulators often keep an eye. Then there's the whole innovation ecosystem. Let's move on to the next one. Because I feel like it's not moving. Can you guys see my, okay, here we are. So I'm just gonna talk about the dominant types of risk that I've seen emerging, particularly specifically in fintech innovation. Yeah. So the first is who is ultimately responsible. One of the things we see is that the innovators will have products that they've developed that straddles the mandate of different regulators, right? So you have a product that's like a payment system. They're like, okay, I want to do something on payments, but I want to bundle some insurance solution in it as well. So you get your approval from like the central bank on the payment side. You go get your approval from the insurance regulator on the insurance side. Who is ultimately responsible for figuring out how that risk plays out at sector level?
In the back of our heads for later.
Sorry? Sorry? I didn't hear that. Did I continue? Okay. So one of the issues is ultimately if regulators are managing or approving innovations at the regulation level, who is dealing with the aggregated risk at the financial sector level, right? We in Kenya, in countries like Kenya, and many African countries, you don't necessarily have a financial level approval process for innovation. Sometimes it's quite regulator specific. So that's one thing. That's one risk that we're trying to figure that out. The other risk is what I mentioned. How are risks prioritized, and how is the process of determining what the most important risk is? What is that process? You know, whose views are really considered and why? Yeah, because then what ends up happening is frankly elite capture. Yeah, and so people like us, who we may not think we're elite, but in many of our economies, we are probably considered part of the elite. So we become a part of the elite capture of what we think these are the risks that, you know, we should be managing, but other people. The other one is fintech and digital inequality. Now, this image on the right is just to give people a bit of a reality check on the level of smartphone penetration in Kenya, which is pretty far ahead. Only about 37% of our population has smartphones. If you're looking at people who earn their income mainly from agriculture, that's 19%. This is important because if your fintech innovation or solution is reliant on anything that's not a very, very basic phone, you're going to build an inequality and opportunity into how your solution is used. And so one of the things we particularly have seen during COVID is that the bottlenecks in tech adoption have really been informing who actually is benefiting from all these solutions that are premised on things like internet access or apps or all these other things. We know that there are innovators who are very cognizant of that, but there is, you know, we just feel that that needs to continue, because if that doesn't happen, digital inequality moves to an inequality economic opportunity, which then deepens income inequality. Like that line really begins to deepen. And then finally is the time frame issue. You know, innovators always say, oh, we want a quick turnaround, you know, regulators are very slow. But the reality is that who's monitoring the short, medium, and long-term impact? You know, even in a situation where in Kenya we have a regulatory sandbox, that's a timestamp period. You've got like a window, but who's monitoring the evolution over time? So that's really at one level. And then finally, this is really at the firm level that I've seen and we're seeing. One is incentives, innovation, hype, and overselling. With the scale of volume that Africa is attracting, particularly in fintech investment, and we saw this a lot in the work that we do, some people are incentivized by things other than actually delivering value. Some people just want to innovate because, yeah, they can look good innovating. There's a lot of overselling of impact, yeah? And sometimes when you're actually asking them, what's the problem you're solving and how are you going to get there? You really need to have people who know what questions to ask, rather than saying, oh, we're in Africa, we're going to create jobs, we're going to generate impact. It's like really an overselling of this thing. And this innovation hype that sometimes, you know, there's the attendant scrutiny. It doesn't happen. The other big thing we're seeing is governance issues. We've seen anyone who follows the African innovation and fintech ecosystem, we're seeing problems with ethical conduct of innovators and some of the firms that they deal with. The big one that really irritates me is burdening the vulnerable with the cost of innovation. So what we see a lot is an innovator with a clean heart sometimes to come into a market and be like, I've got this thing that, you know, I think will solve problems, but ultimately the guinea pigs that will help him or her figure out whether it works or not are often the vulnerable. It's the low income populations, maybe they're treated to serve. It's the micro, small, and medium enterprises being told, oh, try this, you know, try that. And it's not even, sometimes they even come to those groups and your solution isn't even ready. So we were trying to do this in a certain value chain. We're trying to digitize, oh, let's see if you can digitize a certain part of the value chain. And, you know, we did this research and evidence. And at the end of the day, these aggregators who are serious businessmen and women, they're like, why are you disturbing us? Like, is this solution ready? Number one. And then if it's ready, is this going to be useful for me now today to help me manage what I'm dealing with now today? If not, why are you giving me these problems of helping me solve for your solution? And this is a real culture that we're seeing in Africa, that just go and, you know, the burden of the figuring out the innovation, some of that, there's an implicit assumption will be solved by the people that are supposedly going to benefit. The other big one is unclear policy paths to approval. And so this, I think, is an ethical problem because regulators are not communicating to innovators the process, the time frame, and the requirements. You know, just tell innovators it's going to take you about 18 to 24 months. Just tell them so that they know. And then the final one is the lack of creative and supportive financial instruments. And I'll really just close with that because we've seen that these are the stages of innovation. You've got the ideation to proof of concept, to proof of innovation, to proof of business model, to proof of profit model. Really what we've seen, money really only gets interested at the profit and the business model stage. When you can show that you can run your business credibly with the innovation, you get some of the early stage guys, and then the mainstream financiers, the banks don't even want to talk to you until you're really at the proof of profit model. So who's financing all these stages? And what we found is that you need a combination of not only financial instruments, but particularly the expertise, the research and evidence, from business modeling, the mental modeling, which is a form of capital. That is what is really, really lacking. So we're not even getting a good pipeline of like credibly tested ideas, you know. So the few that are coming out of the business and profit model, I mean, kudos to them. So I'll just close with just a few ideas on how do we foster an ethical and dynamic innovation system. First of all,
we'll have to share. We'll have to share that. I'm sorry we'll have to share that.
Good.
Yeah. And I'm really sorry to stop you at this time. So thank you for two really remarkable and wonderful talks in the beginning of the day here. Both so rich and covering so many issues. I saw, and I have also questions myself on the balance between regulation and entrepreneurship. We've looked at that dilemma also as part of our project, and then you raised the issue of ownership, Joanna. We don't have time to follow up right now. We have to push on. I'm afraid. Please shoot questions in the chat. We can follow up through the day there. But we have to simply thank you, Joanna, and thank you, Anzetse. And then I'll invite you, Eskil.
Yep. Yeah, so we're getting ready for the first panel discussion of the